I know I was a couple minutes tardy. I was hustling all the way across this very large school. So really appreciate it. So thank you so much for coming this evening. I'm Jill Briggs-Campbell. I'm the Deputy Secretary of Education for the Agency of Education. I'm very happy to be down here in Brattleboro. I get to check it off my list. I always get to brag to my Vermont native husband that I've now been officially in more Vermont towns than he has, which is a real source of pride in our house. So very glad to be here this evening. So we're also joined this evening by our partners from APA Consulting. They've come out from Colorado once again. They've been joining us since September to be part of our Listen and Learn tour. APA actually has been working in Vermont for several years now, and I kind of joke that I think they might actually understand the complexities of the Vermont system better than most of us do at this point. So they've worked with us on CTE, they've worked with us on ESSER funding, and now they've done a lot of the data reporting in the state profile report, and really been pulling together information that's supporting the commission for the future of education as well. So we're really glad that they're here, happy that they keep coming back to help us out. So the way that we're going to sort of run things this evening is sort of we'll try to keep it brief. Data is not everybody's favorite, it's our favorite, but we'll do sort of a brief kind of data presentation and report out. And then really we want to spend as much time as possible actually doing breakout sessions and talking to you all, and really getting your insights on your local community, and really help that to inform our work moving forward. Okay, so one thing that we actually want to start with is sort of discussing what is the role of the Agency of Education. And I want to acknowledge that's not always clear. So we wanted to kind of go back to basics, because when we do talk about this statewide education agency, it's important to know what it is that we are responsible for and what it is that we do and what we don't do. So the first thing is that we do not set policy or make laws. That's the role of the General Assembly. But we do have a responsibility to implement those laws. We are also the only statewide entity that's responsible for ensuring the delivery of equitable education across Vermont for all students. And that's really the focus of our Listen and Learn, is sort of always coming back to what does student success look like? How do we support student success and student outcomes? It's important to remember that Vermont is really unique in this way, that education is the only government service included in the state's constitution. Our role includes taking a statewide view of education performance in all of its myriad forms. We do talk about, the statewide assessment, but we also look at things like graduation rates. We look at things like chronic absenteeism. Because we are the repository of a lot of data. We did a kind of a brief census early on in the fall, and the agency is responsible for collecting 400 separate state and federal data collections from schools every year. And we've really been focused this fall on using that data, right? Not just collecting it and sending it to the feds, or collecting it and putting it in a digital file folder somewhere, but really bringing it out, dusting it off, and sort of putting it to work to help us understand our system. We also are tasked with overseeing the implementation of state and federal education laws. That's our oversight function. A lot of our federal dollars are actually tied to that oversight function. We facilitate planning to share lessons learned and to promote innovation across the state. And this is something that we really want to lean in on, is highlighting and spotlighting strategies that are working, schools that are doing really great work, and then actually helping to elevate that, right? We have a real opportunity at the agency to highlight what works and then bring it to scale. And then also, we manage over $2 billion annually in state and federal funds. So the agency is focused on promoting equity, educational quality, and sustainability. Hearing from Vermonters across the state is really integral to the development of our strategic plan. The agency has not had a strategic plan for a very long time, and the Listen and Learn is really, for us, the first step in the development of that plan. We're actually sort of coming to the end of our Listen and Learn tour, and the next phase for us is really going to be identifying the priorities that have arisen out of kind of communities and schools and aligning our work. So one thing that's really important to us is that we hear from a lot of folks. I think we've done 12-ish public engagement sessions at this point. We've heard from hundreds of members of the community. In addition, just before this, before all of our public engagement, we do engagement sessions with educators and staff. So we've heard from hundreds of folks who are working in our schools. And shout out to this community. There was a great turnout from educators. And in addition, we've done engagement sessions with education leaders, superintendents, business managers, curriculum coordinators, special educators. So we've really heard from lots and lots of folks. So we wanted to sort of do this quick little code Mentimeter poll and find out who's here today. So we asked you when you came in, which best describes your role in your school community? 3 of you identified yourselves as educators, 8 of you are parents, no students, and that's actually something that we really have not. Can we hand out free candy? What if we had pizza? What can we do to get students to show up on a Tuesday evening? Turns out they won't do it. So we're actually in the process right now of going out to schools. We had our first student engagement session today. It's being led by our partners Up for Learning, who do fabulous work in our schools, really trying to get that student voice. And I have to tell you, I'm very excited. I think students are very practical and specific in their feedback, so we're really excited to get that as well. We also have 7 community members, 2 business owners, and then 4 other. I always assume that other means you wear like way too many hats to just pick one. So I think we probably have a lot of others here. All right, and then we also asked you to rank your top 3 topics of interest. Many of you identified that you're interested in college and career readiness, equitable access for all students, academic performance, and student support services. And there's a whole range of other things that you're interested in, but I do like college and career readiness, Justin. I think that's sort of a newer one for us as well. All right. And then finally, we asked you to indicate your level of engagement with your local school or school district. So none of you said that you have no engagement, and that's great. 1 of you said that it's low, 6 identified medium, and 4 of you said you're pretty engaged with your school community and the school district, which is great. All right, so I will try to wrap up my comments sort of briefly so that Justin can move on to the super fun data. So what is the Listen and Learn Tour? You may have kind of been hearing about this over the course of the fall. As I said, we're at the end of the Listen and Learn, the roadshow as we've been calling it. It's made up of agency staff, and can I ask our agency staff to raise their hands? Thank you so much for driving down here. Agency staff are actually here just to support with some note-taking. So if you see them typing away on their computers, it's so that we have a record that we're able to then kind of report out with fidelity what we heard and learned. It involves community members, all of you, and it's really involved education leaders, educators, school staff, a whole variety of people who are within our education community. We have 5 goals, and I'm not going to read out each one. I'm just going to sort of talk about how they all work together. So as I indicated, the agency has not had a strategic plan for a really long time. And strategic plans matter. They're the lodestone, right? They're an expression of what you're going to prioritize, what you're going to resource, and what your goals are. What is your vision and where are you trying to go? But you shouldn't build a strategic plan until you understand the needs. And that's really what the Listen and Learn is about. It's going out into communities, out into schools, talking to people, and saying, what are the needs that you are seeing in schools? How can we define student success? What are the things that we think are critical that every student in Vermont should have access to before they graduate from school, right? What are those opportunities? And then also acknowledging that we are in a really challenging moment in education. And so how do we balance those desires and sort of opportunities that we want for our students with some really real constraints like affordability, right? And that's something that we'll be talking about today. So these are kind of all of our goals sort of rolled up into one, and those are driving towards the 5th goal, which is developing a strategic plan to support immediate needs and long-term vision. So as we're wrapping up the Listen and Learn Tour, It's going to generate a big summary report that Justin's team is going to have to write. Thank goodness it's not me. And then we are actually going to be using that to identify the agency's priorities, develop the strategic plan, reach back out and say, this is what we've sort of prioritized. Is this right? Are these the right things for us to focus on? And then really drive that work. And that'll be happening this winter. So we're moving right along at a fast pace. We are also working to, sorry, go back one more. In terms of immediate priorities, the legislative season is about to kick off, right? And education is going to be, if not the topic, it'll be one of about 2 main topics. And so using this work that we're doing right now to help inform legislative policy. One of my big mantras, Marcus heard me say it, is, are we gonna break something, right? Before we roll out the next initiative, the next statutory change, the next legislative priority, I always wanna ask people, are we about to break something and we don't even know about it? Do we have the resources to actually implement this thing with fidelity and rigor? Do we know what we're measuring? Do we know what the goal is? How do we know when we're going to be successful? So that's what a lot of this work is we're identifying those priorities, identifying those needs, then using that to inform the policies that will be developed in the legislature. We also are really looking to help districts who are struggling. We know that the FY26, the fiscal year 26 budget, you all are faced with really challenging decisions right now. And so we're actually doing some timely support right now. We've partnered with another consulting firm, New Solutions. They've been working with districts in Vermont for a decade. They're really well known. And they're doing a whole series of kind of bite-sized trainings around things like precision staffing and budget communication. How do you actually give school communities authentic choices that they understand when it comes to making hard budget decisions? So we're actually providing those right now. There was one yesterday. I think there's a couple more tomorrow. And so that will be rolling out to help support. And we've tried to do some plain language reporting. So we issued the Vermont Education Funding Explained report. I really encourage you all to read it. It's very easy to read and easy to understand. It took a very complex thing that's taken me a good 4.5 years to wrap my head around and really laid it out. And I really encourage folks to read that as you're heading into this challenging budget season. Okay. So I think I've got like one more here. So phase 1, we've put out a lot of data. This is a really big goal for us. As I said, we collect 400 different data collections every year, actually putting it to good use, getting some reporting out, helping you all to understand kind of the state of the state. What does our system look like? Phase 2, we did regional planning with education leaders. And phase 3, public engagement and educator. We've seen some themes that have arisen across every part of the state, and then there's always like a unique flavor when we go to different regions. And every time I think I've kind of heard everything, I come to a new community and they'll say something and I'll think, oh, I haven't heard that. That's actually really unique. But these are some of the things that we've heard kind of rise up. The first is a desire for stronger and more accessible community partnerships and more state resources. So one theme that we've heard in a nutshell is schools feel like they're going it alone. They feel like they are faced with really a new demands on how education is delivered. School doesn't look the same as it did when I was growing up, and schools are really struggling to help communicate that, and they feel like they're going it alone, and they're asking for more community partnerships, more interagency work at the state level to help support schools. We've heard that we need more state resources for community members to learn about the budget, and we've tried to do that with the education funding report and this training that we're doing. Reliable, transparent, and easy to understand data. We've just re-released our state profile report, which I'm gonna admit is very wonky and like you have to love data, but I really see it as like the reference manual, right? As we're walking into the legislature, what is the state of the state? Well, here you go. We have described everything that we can sort of easily, well, not easily, it hasn't been easy, Justin, no. We have described a lot of what our education system looks like, how it's unique, how it's different, what are all of its layers. We have definitely heard a need to address student mental health and overall well-being, and with that, educator mental health and overall well-being. We have heard that there's a need to focus on expanding access to college and career learning and readiness. And we'll be talking about that this evening. Again, what are those opportunities that every student needs to have before they walk out the door? What do we all agree on, right? What are fundamentals? And then this other theme has been a need for balance between local autonomy and a desire for more AOE or state level direction. So the way that this has been put, and I really like it, so I'm gonna borrow it shamelessly, is maybe a little less freedom and a little more unity. And part of what we've heard from educators is that the cost of so much local autonomy is a lot of duplication of effort, a lot of not being able to focus on the kids in front of you because you're having to create resources whole cloth, create standards whole cloth, create curriculum whole cloth. And so can we actually agree on some things that the state really needs to be sort of tighter on, maybe fewer recommendations and more requirements or guidelines, to actually help educators and schools focus on the kids in front of them, the teaching and learning piece. Think inspirational music even. Mine would have been a duck quacking, which is less inspirational and very confusing for folks.
Sorry.
That is absolutely fine. All right, so what's coming next? We've re-released the state profile report. We are wrapping up our public engagement sessions. We've done wrapping up our teacher educator planning sessions. We've added in those student engagement sessions. We've been very busy. We are also going to continue to release topical reports. So the education funding system was the first. We have one on special education coming out. Whenever we run across something that like you can't capture in a graph, right? You can't capture in a chart, I sort of turn to APA and I go, topical report, topical report. So we're gonna keep generating those reports. Things like college and career opportunities, things like understanding our tuitioning system, because we do some unique things in Vermont, so tuitioning at a glance. That's on my to-do list for this week, by the way. We also are going to be putting out a big summary report of the Listen and Learn tour. What did we learn? What were those regional themes and differences? What were things that sort of everybody highlighted or maybe were really unique to certain communities? And then generating out of the state profile report, we'll actually have supervisory union and supervisory district level reports as well. All of this is culminating towards the development of an AOE strategic plan that is reflective of our kind of collaboration with all of you. And that's kind of our goal that will drive the agency's work forward, really to support schools and supporting students. That's our lodestar. Okay. All right, you get to take it away, Justin. Thank you. I have to stop talking.
Okay. So we're going to have some conversations. Kind of next, I'm going to do a data presentation, but after that, we're going to have. I think we're getting right at the tipping point. We'll probably have 2 small groups who break out, and we'll have some focus groups and some conversations with folks. And as we do that, we just want to first recognize that we know everyone is here because you care about your schools, and your community, your state. That you have a deep commitment to the education system and to the future success of that system. But we also recognize that education can have some, raise some really strong feelings and opinions. And so that when we have these conversations, there can be some challenges. And so we just really hope everybody can be respectful of each other during the conversations. And we'll have some kind of guidelines that I'll get to right before we jump into those. But overall, hear each other, right? Really listen, and we'll get deeper into that. There are some things we likely will not cover tonight that you perhaps came here that you wanted to talk about. And so we are not talking directly about the cost of education in Vermont, but we want to provide you with information on how the system works and how we kind of think about a path forward with a high quality education for all Vermont students that's also affordable for communities. And so knowing that the conversation will focus on some specific topics tonight, we do have an exit ticket, and there'll be a QR code at the end where you could give us feedback on anything you want to give us feedback on, and it will go to AOE and AOE staff, or putting all that together. And so again, hopefully we can respect each other's differences as we dig into it, and I'll frame those focus group conversations here in a couple of minutes, or the breakout session conversations. But to get kind of us all in the same place, we want to think about the data and level setting everybody on the data. It's a really big screen, and I like to turn the screen, but I'm going to hurt my neck if I do. So I'm going to kind of go off of this piece. But we're going to start talking about the students in the schools. We're then going to get some framework around kind of where Vermont sits In the national context, we're going to talk about expenditures in schools, and then we're going to talk about the budgeting system and the budgeting cycle. And so as we just start thinking about students in schools, what I want to make clear is that you can talk about students in any state, but especially in Vermont, in many different ways. And that can be confusing to all of us, but especially those who aren't sitting in education at any given time. So when we start our conversation here talking about students, we want to talk about enrollment. And what enrollment means is, are the students served in a public setting, actually sitting in this public setting being taught? So those are the students who are enrolled in our schools in Vermont. We're also going to talk about, and I'm going to use a lot of acronyms, and when I use an acronym and don't spell it out at least the first time, someone throw something at me, or at least like raise your hand and wave. We're also going to talk about long-term average daily membership. And that is the count of students that your school district or supervisory union is responsible for educating, though they might not sit in your schools every day. So they might be tuitioned out to other public schools or to other private settings. And so we're going to talk about those two things, but we're going to start by kind of course, mixing those a little bit. And so all the data we're going to talk about is for the school year 2022-23. New data is coming up for 23-24 pretty soon, but this is where we can get all the data for 1 year. And when we look at that, 96% of the students in Vermont are served in traditional public schools every day. So they are in enrollment. It's a little over 80,000 students. But about 2,000 students are publicly paid for students who are going to private academies. About 600 students are publicly paid for students who are going to what we call therapeutic schools, which really means they're students who are special education students who need a setting to be served appropriately. And then a little under 850 students are also publicly tuitioned students who are attending other approved independent schools. So when you add all that up, you get to about 84,000 students. So the students are being served day to day in the traditional public settings. They are served in 22-23, they were served in 287 schools. Those 287 schools were in 118 districts. Those 118 districts were in 51 supervisory union or supervisory districts. That changed then again in 23-24, you now have 119 districts and you have 52 SUSDs. So just trying to make the point, there's variation in the governance in the state and it even changes over time. And then the big map on the right is looking at student enrollment. So again, number of students served in traditional public schools during the day by supervisory unit versus supervisory district. And it really highlights two things. One, you have a lot of variation in the number of students served day to day in different sites. So you have an SU with as low as under 200 students day to day, and an SU with over 4,000. And you can kind of see that by those districts in white have small enrollment, and the districts in dark green have over 4,000 students. And then there's variation from there. And then you can also see that there's large variation in the geographic region that they're serving. And often those districts serving having a low number of enrollment have large geographic footprint. And what they also have, which doesn't show up here, but in the state report you see a lot, is they have almost twice as many students in their long-term average daily membership. So they're responsible for twice as many students as they serve day to day because they're tuitioning a lot of students either to public settings or to private settings. So so there's a lot of variation in what's going on across your school supervisory unions and districts. And then over time, we wanted to look at changes in enrollment. And if you look at the very top line, you see a dark green line. And that is pre-K, so pre-kindergarten through adult ed enrollment from 2004 through that 22-23 school year. And what you'll see is there's a big drop in enrollment coming into and before the pandemic. Most of the loss in enrollment over time actually happened before the pandemic. So that conventional wisdom that the big drop happened around the pandemic, it actually was really occurring ahead of time. And so you see that decline, and we're still seeing decline. Below that, though, you see the dotted blue line, which is just focused on K-12 public students. And what you see is that decline is about 50% greater over time than the decline in the overall student population. And a big part of that is because that orange line or red line at the bottom, the dotted black line at the bottom, which is pre-K students, we had universal pre-K come in around 2017, 2018. More students in the system. It has kind of kept up the total student count on that top green line, but that core group of K-12 students really is declining pretty rapidly. You'll see the red line is your independent schools, both publicly and privately funded students. Growth coming into the pandemic, flattening or even a little decline since. The blue line is your home study students, so homeschooled students. Again, an increase right at the beginning of the pandemic, flattening out or even a little decline since then. So where does the Vermont kind of stack up when we look at some national figures? And these are all coming from groups like the National Center for Education Statistics or all these are coming from the National Center for Education Statistics. When you rank the states with from the largest average size schools to the smallest, Vermont is the 46th smallest. So on average, very small schools. It has the highest number of staff per student in the country, the highest number of teachers per students in the country, and it's the 5th highest expenditures per pupil in the country. In the latest data, there's some data that came out recently. You are moving up the grid on the expenditures per student, and actually, in the latest ranking, I think #1. But you are getting pretty good performance out of that. So there's only one test that is given to a sample of students across the country. And so there are students in every state taking this test. It's the National Assessment of Education Performance. It's given every 2 years. And in reading, Vermont's doing very well. 5th overall in the latest test cycle, which was 2022. In 8th grade reading, 11th in 4th grade reading. Coming down though, more middle of the pack for math, 21st in 8th grade math and 28th in 4th grade math. And when you look at the actual trend though, relative position still high, but the absolute overall performance is coming down more to the national average over time. So you're no longer outperforming the national average as much as you used to be. But then one of the questions is how do you unpack that for different populations of students in Vermont? And so what we wanted to look at is the differences in performance for all students, which is in green, and I apologize, I know you cannot read every line here, but the trend will show. We wanted all students in green, economically disadvantaged students in red, and that's measured by eligibility for free reduced price lunch, English language learners in blue, and special education students in orange. And what we have is English language arts on the top, math on the bottom. On the left is the old test system from 2018-19, and on the right is the latest data with the new test system, 22-23. And effectively what this tells us is no matter which test, no matter what year, your EL students and your special education students especially have much lower performance than your average performance in the state, and your economically disadvantaged students often have 2/3 or even half the level of performance as the statewide average, right? So you have large gaps, not unique to Vermont, in your student performance between average and these subpopulations. So switching over to expenditures per long-term ADM. So we want to look at two things here. And so again, this is all expenditures by your SU or SD for all the students are responsible for. That would include tuitioning out to other settings. And the top looks at all sources. So there's federal funds, there's grants, there's categorical funding. Any dollar that your district is receiving, we include it up top. And when you look at that, you see that on average in the state, expenditures per long-term ADM has grown about $5,000 between fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 23. Most of that growth occurred in what we call special revenue funds, which is the dark green box. And really a lot of that is your federal funding. And so a lot of that was the elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds, or ESSER funds. And so you had a lot of growth. But we know as a state, Vermont often really focuses on what they call the ed fund expenditures. And so those are the expenditures that are part of setting the tax rates that you have. It's really, effectively what's in the general fund. And so we peel that onion and we look at that on the bottom of this page, of this slide. And what you'll see is the growth in those dollars is actually only $3,000 per pupil over that same amount of time. So $2,000 of the growth in spending came from funds outside of your ed fund. And so you have lower growth when you just look at the ed fund than we look at total ed spending. And really in part that's because of that huge increase in federal funds during the pandemic. Next, we wanted to think about the relationship between spending and size first, and then need. And so at the top, what you will see, again, looking at total spending on the left, and then just ed fund spending on the right, is that smaller settings tend to have higher spending than larger settings. That's not unusual. That's something we refer to in school finance as the reverse J. It's very common. As you get smaller, you tend to need more dollars. Smaller here is any district that's 1,000 long-term ADM or less. What we also know is generally in those smaller settings, you tend to have higher need also. And so then we went though and unpacked that and just looked at need. And when you do that on the left, what you'll see is low need is any district with less than 32% free reduced price lunch. High need on the right is any district with over 43.5%. And what you see is that lower need districts have less dollars to spend per pupil than higher need districts. That's exactly what you would kind of want to see in a good school finance formula. Where you have more need, you generally need more resources to serve students. But that's only really the case, or it's much more the case when you include your federal funding. When you take that off on the right and only look at education and fund expenditures, that difference is less than $1,000. And so key caveat here. We're back in FY23. So those of you who stay up at night and you read all the laws and you think about school funding, you know that Act 127 came into place the next fiscal year. Act 127 has more targeted capacity towards those special needs, so it's going to be really important to see if that changes this picture when we get that updated data, hopefully very soon, for the last school year. Okay, so we say we are not going to focus on how schools are funded and local that piece, but we are going to talk a little bit about the general budgeting and funding cycle in the next couple of slides. And so first we just want to talk about what does it actually look like on the funding timeline? And we have an arrow here. Because when we think of districts, we really think that districts are landing last year's budget as they're working on this year's budget as they're planning for next year's budget, right? They're never doing one budget at a time. They have multiple budgets that they're really working through. But in a single year, what you have is the tax commissioner setting the projected tax rates. It's actually, I think, happening kind of right around now. Then school boards will start to develop their budgets. Voters will vote on those budgets. Once all the budgets in the state are voted on, we know the total amount needed for education, and through that education fund, that's when the homestead yield and the non-homestead rates are set. And that's basically to balance that amount of money that's voted on throughout the state. Towns then send out their tax bills, and then districts start receiving their funding. First payment in September, another in December, and the last one in April. And then in the fall, kind of right around now, well, probably about a month or two ago, start thinking about the district budget again for the next school year. Okay, just a couple more slides. This slide really comes back to, we've heard from the community of just this basic question of how can we as a community have a relatively stable or absolutely stable budget, but still see changes in our tax rates. And so the next slide is going to get a little bit more into it, but in part it's because you have a statewide funding system. All students are funded throughout the state, collectively through your statewide funding system. And so a couple things can happen. And so we're going to imagine a Vermont that only has 3 districts, and we're going to assume we're all living in District 2, which is a district with a stable budget. And so we're in a year, we've gone out, we've set a stable budget, and yet we see an increase in our tax rates. And we're going to talk about 3 ways that could happen. First, and kind of the most basic is, well, the overall increases in all the other districts is still a positive, right? So here we see District 1 is going up $500,000. We're staying stable. District 2 is going down $250,000, which means our overall amount of education funding in the state still goes up $250,000. We solve for statewide funding collectively, and thus tax rates need to go up because we have more dollars we have to raise throughout the state. So that's one way. The next 2 are a little bit more nuanced and harder to think about, but absolutely can occur. So let's say we set a stable budget. We're not going to spend another dollar than we did the year before as a community, but we have less kids. We, in the state, really measure local spend at a per pupil level. And so if you have the same total amount of dollars, but less kids, you actually look like you are spending more each year because you're spending more per kid. So if that numerator stays the same, denominator goes down, you look like you're spending more. So it might take more local taxes to do that. The second one, even more nuanced, is that you have the same number of kids, but you have less English learners, or you have less economically disadvantaged kids. That numerator that denominator, what we're dividing the student count, is weighted by need. So if you have the same total dollars, but less need in your community, you also look like you're spending more per pupil. So there's a couple things that can happen. It's what we talk about all the time is really complicated and a lot going on. And so that's part of why we want to have some resources for folks to understand it more and more over time. But it really comes down to this last slide, which is the state has this statewide system in an effort to increase equity. And really what it's trying to do here is to make sure that schools who have more students who have higher needs, so generally English learners, students who are economically disadvantaged, for whom we know it takes more resources to get the same opportunity, that they can spend more dollars without triggering a greater tax burden only on the local community, right? Having higher need and then also having to have higher tax rate. That is trying to be not taken out of, but adjusted for in the system. And so what it allows for is the larger budgets in places with larger need without that fully falling, the funding need falling on the local district. Okay, 3 more slides. So we're gonna put a lot of this together in the next slide. And I'm going to level set what you're going to see here in a second. So we're going to plot every SU and SD in the state in one of these 4 quadrants. And it ranges from, in the top left, those SUSDs who are high performing but lower spending. Or in the top right, higher performing and higher spending. And then in the bottom left, lower performing, lower spending. And the bottom right, lower performing, higher spending. So kind of like top left is every economist dream. You're spending less, you're getting higher performance. Bottom right is kind of where you're on the other end of that. You're spending a lot more, but you're performing worse. But we're going to plot each of the districts with a circle that represents the size of the district. So bigger the circle, bigger the district. And then that circle is going to be color coded. If it's red, it means they have the highest student need in the state. They have the most free reduced price lunch students. If it's green, like a really dark green, it means it has the lowest student need. And what you start to see is where our denominator is that long-term ADM, there isn't a wide variation. So the variation in spending really is going to be kind of left to right on the x-axis. There's not a huge amount of variation in spending, but there's a lot of variation in performance, which is the y-axis up and down. But what we started to see pretty clearly is that you are much more likely to be relatively large and in green if you're high performing. So you tend to have low need and have a little bit more scale to be higher performing. You're not necessarily, and you're maybe spending a little less, but you're not spending a lot less. And if you're lower performing, it tends to, again, be much more related to your need than your spending. You tend to have less dollars to spend, but not a lot. But you definitely are going to get lower performance the more need you have. And so if we go way back a couple slides where we showed, especially in the Ed Fund in FY23, that there's almost no relationship between state funding and the need of districts, that starts to play out here. We aren't generating the resources in the places who have the most need to get the outcomes we want to see. Okay.
Jess, you have a question.
Yeah.
Actually, can you say that sentence again, because it's really important.
Okay. What was the sentence I said?
You said we are not generating the resources.
Yeah. So you're not in FY23 again. When we see Act 127, things could shift. You're not generating the resources that are correlated with the need of the districts, and that's really, and then you start to see the outcomes from that pretty clearly here. You have a question?
Where's our district?
That is an excellent question.
Yeah, we purposefully don't have them call out because then people only focus on that. But if you want to reach out to us, we'll tell you which one is your district.
We do want to know.
I do want to know.
We do want to know.
Yeah, so-
We're sitting here, we want to know.
Yeah.
Understood. I don't know which one it is.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. I do not have the table that generates this in Tableau with me, so but we can pull that at a later date. Okay.
We'll share it with your superintendent.
Okay. So a couple things that the AOE and the state are doing for kind of short-term cost containment versus long-term transformation. So short-term, trying to get through the next couple or single budget cycles, hosting some trainings, and Joe really talked about this with New Solutions, thinking through a really cost-effective education best practices around budget building, and helping districts with just budget communication, so they can they can really help the community understand how they're building the budget, why they need what's in the budget. Longer term, trying to find the balance between statewide budget strategies that help reduce costs, but at the same time improve student outcomes. Producing some really strong how-to guides for education leaders on select strategies and practices. And then not just doing one time, having ongoing training for school and district leaders on their budgeting practices. Okay. So we're going to shift into the breakouts. Do you think we should do two? I know I only had you do one set of papers, but I can do a second. All right, so we're going to do breakouts in a minute. What we'd love to have is probably a group in the top left over here, and we're just going to try to break out evenly. I will say if you're here with a friend, it's often great to split up and hear what the other groups are doing. Feel free to do what you like, but we'd like to get I think we have about 30 people, so about 15 on the top left, and we'll do about 15 down here in the bottom right, my right, your left. What are we going to be concentrating on? So we're going to really first talk about student success, and you're going to help us think about really how do you define student success in your community? How would you identify student success? Then we want to think about what are the type of student supports that would be needed to get that to that student success, and then any impacts that has on Vermont's funding system. So you're going to have someone who's helping lead the session. It'll either be myself or Jen, and then we'll have a note taker from AOE for each of the sessions, and then we'll have a report out. So I promised some norms as we get going. My biggest thing so I'll be talking a lot and kind of facilitating the conversation. What I really encourage folks to do is actively listen. Don't listen to respond, right? So hear what other folks are saying. You have your opportunity to kind of make your point about what you want to have. We don't necessarily need to be responding to everybody else and what they're saying. So let everyone kind of have the ability to put on the table what they'd like. Assume positive intent. So we already talked about that. Everyone here clearly cares about schools in your community. You also wouldn't be spending a night here with us. We will be trying to move through at a certain pace. I think we're going to have pretty good time, so I'm not too worried about that, but it could be at a point where we say, we're moving on from this section to another section. And then if for any reason, and we already talked about you're unable, uncomfortable to make a comment publicly, we will have that exit ticket, and you're absolutely able to provide us additional feedback. If you don't want to use an online exit ticket, we can give you a piece of paper at the end of this to write something down for us, and we'll take that from you. So we're going to take 5 minutes or so to split up again, hoping you guys can help us count out. I will say the teachers were not perfect at this. We were about 2/3, 1/3 instead of half and half. No math teachers clearly in the group, but it was a great discussion. But if we can do, try about half in that, again, the corner over here and half down here, we'll get going in about 5 minutes. So we're going to do just some big themes from the 3 buckets from each of the 2 groups.
Okay, we actually, you all needed extra paper too. Good work, everybody. That's a sign of a good conversation. So I will just hit some big themes here. When we were talking about how do we define student success, there were some themes around things like resilience, kind of emotional maturity, the ability to roll with change in healthy ways, the ability to resolve conflict, compassion, kindness, and well-being. So some of those, we'll call them soft skills. There was also a theme around like a love of learning, a feeling of competence as a learner. And this idea of feeling competence and mastery at an early age that then gives you confidence as you move through the school system. And then we also talked about some measures of learning, like how do you know when a student is successful? What are some of the measures that we can use? So we talked about graduation rates. We talked about we have a gap in statewide measures for student performance in high school. So we highlighted that as actually a gap that we have. We also talked about proficiency-based learning and maybe its potential strengths as a way to educate and deliver education, but maybe some of its weaknesses or areas for improvement in terms of how does a parent or a student actually understand how well their student is doing. And that we maybe have some further to go to sort of implement that with fidelity and rigor. We also, as we moved kind of over into student supports and experiences, we talked about a whole child approach, understanding that there's sort of sequential learning and skill building that needs to start from a young age and then really have sort of continuation all the way through the middle grades and high school, and that families really need to understand that so they have a better sense of what's going on with their kids. We talked about kind of multiple pathways and modalities for learning. And with that was, as students get into high school, we've sort of stuck with a very traditional, like we're still in classrooms, but maybe there's a real opportunity to leverage community programs and partnerships and actually get kids out of the classroom and into the world and engaging with adults. We also emphasize the importance of having a mentor, a trusted adult, the need for teacher collaboration, strong leadership in terms of principals. One of the critical sort of keys for success of a school community is having a really strong principal. We also talked quite a bit about how can families be parents, caregivers, be more engaged and helping to support both the school community and their students' learning. One thing that we had heard from educators earlier is that they're feeling this distance between sort of what happens when the kid leaves the school, and we know they need to practice literacy, but we also know that that's not happening. And so on the flip side of that, from sort of the parent and family perspective, we talked about what are the ways that schools can sort of first understand the realities of a lot of parents, but then what are some of the barriers, maybe unintentional, that schools have to actually getting parents into the classroom. And we talked about some really basic things, right? Like the fact that changes in kind of school security has actually created this sort of barrier, and it might be a necessary barrier, but how do we acknowledge that and sort of get families and caregivers back into the school? We talked about the criticality of universal meals as something that all students should have access to. We talked about the really critical importance of homeschool liaison or social workers to do that, really like that school to home, sometimes literally driving to the home to connect with students who maybe have become chronically absent or maybe are dealing with a really challenging family situation and bring them back into school where they can access social services and educational opportunities. And then we talked about this idea that schools need to have respect for all students' multiple identities, and that it's a place where they feel sort of valued for their whole self. And then we moved over to budgeting, and we had some really concrete kind of examples here. So the first was pulling out what we're sort of calling social services as a big bucket from the education fund and move them over to, one example was sort of the Agency of Human Service budget, which is general fund. We talked about health insurance cost controls. We know that health insurance is a driver of costs, right? Because 80% of budgets are personnel costs, and then health benefits go on top of that. We talked about taking a look at tuitioning costs for independent schools and how do we hold those schools at least to the same standards or measure their performance. We also talked about the need for timely and standardized statewide data around student performance to support budgeting decisions. And there's a misalignment, I would fully acknowledge, in something that we've prioritized in the agency getting out timely assessment data, but also again for high school, there is no statewide assessment after 9th grade. So what are some standard measures that we could have at the state level that would support budgeting and sort of that ability to compare? We also talked about the need for state support for capital improvements for schools, teacher and staffing ratios, getting a better understanding of why our ratios are the highest and the lowest in the country. And then also looking at the CTE funding structure and how that can often create actually sort of competition for resources with sort of the quote unquote traditional school setting.
And we are going to move these sheets over to that wall as Jen gives a little summary. We each just got 3 dots, and we shouldn't take a Thanksgiving break because I completely forgotten about the 3 dots. On your way out, we would love for you to look across any of the sheets and pick kind of your top 3 things that you want to highlight or amplify, and we'll take that as part of our reporting out.
All right, thanks. We used a lot of papers. We had some really great discussion. And when we started talking about indicators of student success, first was students being engaged, interested, and on task when they're in the classroom. Student attendance is a key measure of student success. Broad participation in activities and extracurriculars and events at the school. A high sense of belonging, coming down to school culture, a sense of belonging, feeling included, and feeling that the school is a safe place for students to be. We talked about reading by 3rd grade as being a key indicator of student success. A lot of talk about personalized learning, making sure that students are really engaged in their learning, that they have an opportunity to work on projects that are of interest to them, seeing themselves as learners, and making sure that students have the skills for emotional regulation in the classroom. A thriving arts program, arts, music, foreign language, those were all seen as really important. Looking at post-secondary, students being prepared to do what they want, to have the skill set to do what they want to do when they leave high school. Family engagement and staff retention were also seen as key indicators of school success. If you've got family members and members of your community active in your school, that's a sign that you're doing something well. We talked about the importance of expectation, high expectations for all student groups, and making sure that just because a student may fall into one or another category, that expectations for them are not lower than other student groups. And really kind of the foundation for student success, that students have food in their bellies, that they have housing to go home to, and that they have a caring teacher or adult that they feel connected with in the classroom. Moving on to some of the student opportunities and experiences, outdoor education was something that's really highly valued. Again, committed adults being actively engaged in the school community. Really feeling like during COVID, adults from the community really exited the school buildings, and they don't always feel like they're welcomed back without some serious hurdles. We talked about targeted social emotional learning, and that often that's really focused at the elementary level right now, and making sure that those foundational skills are there at the elementary, but that there's support all the way through K-12. Public pre-K, really important, along with universal free meals, that those felt are really important to the student experience. We also talked about the need for coordination among state agencies, and that there's a lot of opportunity to improve that and improve services to students within there. Growing support or support for a growing English language learner population. Also felt an area where AOE could provide some support is in guidelines around media literacy. Moving on to budget. We talked about declining enrollment, that yes, it exists, and we're feeling the impact in this part of the state, but also on a school-by-school basis, you may see ebbs and flows in that enrollment. The tax rate, the closing of schools, travel distance to schools may be actually encouraging some families to move out of the area. And an issue with affordable housing and access to housing as being another potential contributor to declining enrollment. Talked about healthcare costs and the impact that healthcare costs have on the school budget, and that the school budget may be going up, but you might not actually be getting anything more than you did the year before if that increase is due to healthcare costs. We talked a lot about small schools and how valued small schools are. particularly at the high school level, that it's important to have a minimum so that you can offer the range of high school opportunities that you want to offer that may be difficult in a much smaller high school. And then we talked about how districts might be able to work together a little bit more, not talking about consolidation, just talking about teamwork. And some of the areas where food services, transportation, thinking about innovative practices like coming together to do a collaborative school environment for students who are leaving the school that's a really engaging environment to bring those kids back into education. So that was sort of highlights of our conversation.
You didn't give us enough circles.
So everybody now has their 3 dots. What we'd like for you to do is to come and take a look across both groups. You don't have to stick to your own group. And those areas that kind of resonate the most for you, that you feel like this, if you have your 3 dots to distribute, this is where you're going to do them. Go ahead and mark those there.
Yeah, and then so you will be free to go after you do that, but I want to remind folks, we've got the exit ticket through the QR code, or we also have some hard copies here if you have anything else you want to provide feedback on. Thank you guys so much for taking the time tonight.
And I just want to say thank you so much. Really wonderful, thoughtful conversation. I think you can see just from all the pieces of paper that you filled up that there's really great ideas. I really appreciate how like thoughtful, respectful, concrete everybody was. And thank you so much for spending the evening with us. Hope everyone goes home. I'm going to Burger King. I'm very excited about that. I've been to Burger King forever. And so thank you all for coming out tonight. And more to come. This is step 1. This is not one and done. This is really the start of a big journey that we're all going to go on together. So thank you.